I don't think you ever define yourself through what you're opposed to. In terms of that, well, I don't like guns, and that's what makes me a Canadian. Oh, come on, right? Like, what really makes you Canadian? What makes you a Canadian is the way you adapt to changing seasons. What makes you a Canadian is what gives you pride. What takes you pride in. What makes you Canadian is the future you imagine for your children and grandchildren. What makes you Canadian is the idea that, as with our forefathers and mothers, you look at this vast, terrifying land and you say, I'm going to conquer that. I am going to build something special. I am going to at times exploit it, but I am going to build a peaceful, prosperous nation using all those resources that were given us to do it. And we will be the envy of the world.
Hello, welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy here. Canadian culture is at a crossroads. For over 70 years, the framework for arts and media funding in this country has remained largely unchanged, even as Canada has become much more diverse, more digital, and more disconnected from any unifying cultural vision. From the CBC to the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, from municipal arts grants to federal media funds, we now face a patchwork system riddled with duplication, inefficiency, and even a deep uncertainty about its purpose. And as geopolitical pressures rise and American cultural dominance intensifies, the stakes for a strong Canadian identity and how we fund it have never been higher. Joining me today is Peter Menzies, a senior fellow at MLI, former vice chair of the CRTC, and past publisher of the Calgary Herald. His recent paper, A New Vision for Canadian Culture, calls for nothing less than a Massey Commission 2.0, a bold rethink of how Canada supports its creators, its institutions, and its cultural sovereignty. And before we get started, I just want to give a reminder to please like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these ideas. So, Peter, thanks for coming back to the podcast.
My pleasure as always. Good to see you.
Yeah, so last time we were here, we were talking about the CBC. I'm sure they will come up again in today's discussion, but we wanted to focus on cultural policy, something that doesn't get a whole lot of attention, I guess you could say, in Canada, but certainly comes up from time to time. Tell us about the framing of your paper. You note, as I just alluded to, how much has changed since the Massey Commission, which really launched the current cultural strategy that the federal government is rolling with, and beyond the demographic and technological shifts. What in your view has changed in how we conceive of Canadian culture and national identity?
I think the biggest thing most recently is the sudden awareness of a sense of national identity for it. The Trump saber rattling over 51st state and the trade talks and the usual disruptive Trump nonsense frightened a lot of people, right? It frightened enough people that we elected a government that we didn't think we were going to elect, and made people think, oh, Canadian first, and that sort of stuff. And so I think that may be the opportunity to trigger the conversation, which has long been needed as the nation has evolved into a very, very different country today than it was 75 years ago when the Massey Commission was struck.
Mm-hmm. Certainly takes an external threat or a crisis, perceived or real, to drum up basically the public attention and support to revisit some of these potentially thorny issues, which I think is fair to say these are. Let's back up though. What was the Massey Commission? What did it uncover and lay out in terms of cultural policy in
Sure,
Canada?
the Massey Commission, and this actually talks a lot about how efficient government used to be comparatively, despite not having all the technological advantages that we have today. The it was conceived in 1949, just in the shadow of the Second World War, and at the height of, I guess you'd call it nuclear awareness, in terms of the Soviet Union. Remember that? Anybody? Hydrogen bombs, etc. But it was a look at, again, Canada's how do we create a better Canadian identity or preserve Canadian identity. So it was a five-member commission that traveled the country, and in the course of about a year and a half was able to do that and come up with a report with a number of recommendations, some of which were accepted and some weren't. But it basically scanned the field of all the stakeholders and said, how do we better promote, particularly given that we're sleeping with an elephant next door, particularly in terms of the entertainment industry and that, and maintain Canada's sense of its own identity and its own culture. And that basically became the foundation for national institutions, some of which we have go back to then, some of which actually, like the National Film Board, predate that. And the genesis of the whole idea of art and culture being a public good that deserves legislative support.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so we've basically established these, institutions that continue, more or less to this day. And I suppose the philosophical approach is, Canada's a bit small. We have a large neighbor, and we also, have different founding cultures, and there's a kind of need to um, preserve this healthy tension there. And then, of course, more recently, multiculturalism has become foundational, for better or for worse, to Canadian identity. Is that, do I have that right? Is that the approach to cultural policy that these institutions seek to carry out?
Well, I think when a lot of them were founded, and like just to drop in for a second, like you mentioned the duplication. Like we now have three film bodies, right? The Canada Media Fund funds film, Telefilm funds film, National Film Board funds film. I'm not sure if that's the best way to go with that. Maybe we just have one body that deals with film, right? Then because you've also got provincial film commissions that you can add on to that. And then you've got, in many cases, municipal organizations going with that as well. But I think when you go back to what the nation looked like, even when more of these institutions were emerging in the 1960s and 1970s, it was still the British-French structure overall. Canada was more multicultural than it revealed itself, but it was still largely British background and French background. The British part has pretty much gone. It's been taken over by other sides. The French part is still there, but we're doing things now, and this can be very controversial. So I have to be very careful the way I say it. But it was set up, for instance, on a funding formula that still works through the provincial government, that 2/3 of the money goes to Anglo production and 1/3 goes to Franco production. That was put in place at a time when 30% of Canadians spoke French in the home. That number is now less than 20%, but the funding levels are still the same. And the only way to keep everybody happy with that is just to give them more money, right? So the amount of money keeps growing. But that is something that really, we need to have a grown-up conversation about. I think most sensible people are in favor of the preservation of the minority language and wouldn't mind, a little bump up, like if it's 20%, why not 25%? But if you were to say that, and I once made the mistake of saying it at the CRTC, the room just goes silent, right? So we need to talk about that, I think, somehow. or address it or confirm it. But if we want to confirm it, we confirm it and explain why. If we're funding French product, it's at a pace about 150% higher than we're funding English product. Um,
Hmm.
yeah,
So
that's one of the issues.
yeah, there's this elephant in the room across many policy files, realistically, of dealing with the uniqueness of Quebec, and then increasingly there is changing cultural landscape, and we have a lot of diaspora communities, and so more of our cultural funding is going to this now. One of the things you note in your paper is, yes, this the duplication of funds and agencies, and levels of funding, even from different tiers of government. And so I'm wondering if you can, do you think that's derivative of some of these tensions and an unwillingness to confront kind of what cultural policy is about, and the French, English, and cultural dynamic questions? And second, just paint a picture for us of what this looks like in terms of number of entities and funds and financial impact and all of that.
Well, in the paper, in the appendix to the paper, I give a list of, I think, about 14 different federal agencies. And then you would have to add on to that at least one agency for every province, probably agencies for the territories and municipals. So you're getting into dozens of agencies across the country, at least 25, 30 various bodies. And I think one of the big things is, like, I don't want to be the sort of guy saying, well, look at all this, rubbish and waste and that sort of stuff. In terms of that, I'm looking at efficiency and, being user friendly. And if you're trying to access funds, if you're a filmmaker, you're trying to make a documentary film, or you're trying to make any other type of film, where do you start? Who do you go to? Where is shouldn't there be like a single point of contact? 611 dial film, or something like that, where somebody can go to, instead of having to sort of hire somebody to help you do that, right? And a lot of these are smaller operations, and when they're trying to get started, you're adding quite a regulatory burden on them in terms of that. As for the provincial bodies, I mean, I don't really have a problem with that, because what they're trying to do is, Canada's a very large country, and the sort of cookie cutter Ottawa centric approach doesn't fit perfectly in every place. So you need to have some nuances. Why why municipalities are involved is maybe a larger question, deserves a little bit more examination, particularly given that they are creations of provincial governments. One would think that the city of Toronto's approach to film should fit comfortably within the Ontario government's approach. Like, it's the capital, and everything's right there. So I think that's the sort of thing I'd like to look at. What the municipalities might do well is, a lot of them have these sort of micro funds that help sort of community celebrations on a small scale and that sort of stuff. That I think would probably get too complex for a provincial body, but at the same time, you might take a look at, are there better ways to incent that than just $50,000 checks from City Hall, or $10,000 checks and that sort of stuff? Is there some better way for people to raise the money for those endeavors? Because it can kind of, you got to be careful with that, right? Because what are you doing? What are you funding exactly, right? Is it really contributing to the culture, or is it you know an exchange? Is it transactional somehow in the relationship between City Hall and those communities? That's worth being looked at.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems a common theme in our country that different jurisdictions are getting into each other's knitting, and we've seen that certainly on like the healthcare file and this interprovincial trade barriers right now, and it seems like something similar is happening here. Um, how did it occur in this space in particular, in your view? What are some of the politics of it, so to speak? I would surmise, this is my outside perspective, that it's cultural groups, arts, entertainment, media, so they would be more liberal friendly, and liberal governments are generally more want to distribute funds to groups. It's pretty politically advantageous. What do you make of the dynamic of how this kind of proliferation of funds and entities has occurred?
Well, I mean, there's different ways of looking at it. In Alberta, for instance, Alberta has done a very good job of developing a film industry. A lot of it, almost all of it, well, I shouldn't say almost all of it, but a great deal of it is Alberta acting as a venue for Hollywood films and other foreign films. The exchange rate on the dollar has always been very good for that. The same with British Columbia. They're American, going back years to the X Files and others. TV shows filmed there all the time, and Southern Ontario, Toronto is great for that too. So in that sense, it's an industrial strategy. You're building, an economic base, and you can claim too that it's helping in provinces like Alberta and British Columbia, which are have large tourism industries, that it helps promote that. I think that argument's a little weaker, but in terms of employing people and that sort of stuff, that's really an industrial rather than a cultural subsidy, because the British Columbia film industry and the Alberta film industry is providing jobs to Canadian people in the creative sector, but it's not necessarily producing content that is enhancing the nation's sense of itself, right? I mean, The Last of Us, the series, the post-apocalyptic series, was filmed mostly in Alberta. About $200 million spent in the local economy. I can watch it and go, "Hey, that's the gift shop in High River, or that's the place here," and I can have fun doing that in addition to enjoying the program. But it's not really making me go, "Oh, that's what it means to be Canadian." That's and that should be part of that. It's got to be. I'm kind of an outcomes guy, and I'm not
Yeah.
seeing the outcome that we actually have a better sense of our own nation's identity.
Yeah, well, very good. That's where I wanted to go next, talking about what is the purpose of this cultural policy strategy. What does success look like? Is it economic development? Is it identity formation, artistic excellence, social cohesion? Should one of these take priority?
Yeah, I think social cohesion and national identity should probably be, top level priorities and be measured. My experience with the CRTC indicates, and I think this is shared by most people who serve on the commission, it's certainly my experience that liberal appointees, conservative appointees, after you go in thinking that the whole structure is about Canadian identity and culture. And there are certainly aspects of that for sure. And I think the music industry has done better than most in terms of that. But through all the film and television programming, it's successful in that it provides screenwriters with work. It provides actors with work. It provides independent producers with funds with which they can use to make films. But I think it's very questionable, to say the least, that it's been successful at getting content about Canadians and about our history and about our character and about our own sense of, even if it's self-deprecating, our own sense of humor and history. I think you could probably argue that it fails on that level. So it celebrates its success as an industrial subsidy, but I think we're just kidding ourselves if we're pretending that it gives us a better sense of ourselves. We all watch American television. We all attach to American sports leagues, right? Our sports broadcasters are just filled with U.S. You cannot watch a national women's or men's soccer league on them, or a basketball league or lacrosse league or anything, but you can watch Notre Dame versus, I don't know, somebody's Boilermakers on U.S. television. CNN gets watched as much, if not more, than CBC News Network. So a lot of our cultural formation is still coming out of the United States, and very little of it from Canada. For billions and billions of dollars that we've spent, nobody has made a film about Vimy Ridge. You know, the Australians made a good film about Gallipoli, which was their moment. We haven't got near that, and in the recent years, we've just been taking down statues. And if you want to do that, so fine, but you got to replace them with something, and we haven't replaced them with anything.
Yeah, it's interesting. Speaking to an Australian actually the other day, noted that of the Anglosphere countries, Kanzak, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, well, and certainly the US, Canada maybe stands out as having a rather weak or ephemeral sense of national identity. Like all of these places, I would argue, have stronger senses of it. And well, perhaps that is due to some unique things of Canada's culture as it's developed over time. I would certainly suggest that a culture of multiculturalism, which I actually I call it an anti-culture, because it's all fine and well to have many cultures and be welcoming and opening to them, but it's this idea of like, what's the substrate of diversity? Is it embedded in some overarching unity, or is it just this kind of diversity all the way down? And I would suggest it's increasingly the latter. And you mentioned, yeah, the post-national state and this sort of sense of national identity. uh, do you think that goes some way to explaining it? As you note, there are many things I think about the cultural policy. It's it's doing a good job of subsidizing the industry, but not certain types of outputs. And I'm wondering, maybe that's because of there isn't something that's kind of prior to that a little bit that we really point to and say, oh, I'm proud of that, or oh, I would really like to make art um, about what it means to be Canadian. What's your take on that?
Well, there's two factors. One, and as with all things in Canada, one is French and one is English. I don't think Quebecers suffer from any lack of self identity. I think their sense of self identity and the French Canadian sense of identity is very strong. I think it's on, and it's a large part because they fought for it. They've held firm. They didn't want to be uh, anything other than they are. I mean, they've evolved. I mean, the Quebec of today is a much different Quebec than from the Massey Commission days of 1950. And by the way, the Massey Commission was criticized for not having enough francophone input, right? Which shows you that some things don't change, right? So you have that going, but I think they've been quite successful in having a sense of identity. I think sometimes going back through the separatist years in the 60s and 70s, or the more aggressive separatist years, English Canada has been afraid to assert its sort of sense of identity, lest it be in conflict with that French Canadian sense of identity. Once everybody figured out that there was no way in a country this size you were going to get everybody to be bilingual, um, and to sort of merge into this single unit instead of the two founding nations. We went in a different way. The multicultural thing is, I think, has been confused. Um, there's one thing to be multiracial, multi-ethnic, welcome people from all countries and backgrounds, and that sort of stuff. I mean, the whole nation's history is one of immigrants, right? I mean, they were largely British for a time, but then also Ukrainian and Eastern European and Russian. And I go for a walk here and I hear Ukrainian spoken, I hear Russian spoken, I hear Tagalog spoken, that sort of stuff. But you also need to have a shared sense of identity. And for years, I don't think it's there anymore. but I remember seeing it on the Heritage Canada website, or maybe it was Immigration Canada. And it was telling people, come to Canada and you can live just as you're living now, but just in Canada. And I was thinking, well, I don't think that's a good idea, right? Because otherwise, why are you coming to Canada, right? Because you're coming to Canada because you think it's got better opportunities, it's got better this, better that. I'm I'm a big fan of when it comes to that of the way Sir Wilfrid Laurier put it, and he delivered a speech. I think it was in Edmonton at the on September the 1st, 1905, and it was the day when Alberta and Saskatchewan became provinces. And I don't quite have the exact words in front of me, but words to the effect, let all of us, whether we've been here for 200 years or 10 years, right, or 2 years, honor the lands of our fathers, honor the lands and traditions of our fathers, but should all of us work together to build the land of our children. And I thought that was and I still do think that was a very good way of putting it, because I can wear my kilt when on occasions, and I think, and everybody enjoys Carib Fest and other things like that. But when when the rubber hits the road, our focus is forward,
Yeah.
not past. Our focus is linking arms, having a shared sense of identity. Even if we don't have shared histories, family histories, we have a shared sense of identity and the sense of the sort of country we're trying to build together.
Yeah, I like that. I think it speaks to the uniqueness of Canada, as you say, as a kind of a settler nation. So we don't necessarily have all of those deeper historical ties that many peoples do. But unlike the contemporary vision, which basically wants to sever all ties to the past and talk about some future where we don't even need to be joined together necessarily. We can kind of just be all doing our own disconnected things. It harkens to a future built together. So the genuinely progressive conservative, I dare say.
Well, yeah, what's the point? All you can do is you can't do anything about the past,
Hmm.
in terms of that. You can reflect on it, and I have a crest here in my office of um, uh, for a family member killed in the First World War, the words are, faithful, to their country and the traditions of their forefathers and that sort of stuff. Sure, you want to keep that stuff. Nobody wants to take that away from anybody, but you've got to put something in place for today, right? And life isn't just about memories. Life is about today and tomorrow, and children and grandchildren, and all that sort of stuff. So I think, to sort of get back in line there with, it's long past due that we sat down and had a good hard look at these things, right? There are we are French and English in our foundation and in our basis. We should be able to build a sense of cohesive national identity through cultural institutions efficiently run for both the consumer, and one that has actual consumer outcomes. That sort of measures something measurable, right? That's um, uh, so you can take a look at it. This is sort of frustrating with the CRTC. You spend all this time and money dividing up the pie, sending money to making sure the Writers Guild gets this, making sure actor gets that, and forcing all these things. And nobody ever sits down and does an annual measure as to whether Canadians have a better sense of their own cultural identity as a Canadian this year than they did last year.
Hmm.
Because I think if we did, we wouldn't like the answer.
Hmm.
And putting our head in the sand and pretending that we are a real country when we don't have the attributes that most real countries have, you know, it's kind of, Lucien Bouchard was the guy who once said Canada is not a real country. Um, and he might not have been wrong
Hmm.
about some of those things. I think we need to really sit down and figure out what are we really. No, we don't want to be the 51st state, but what are we, like in some sort of cultural annex, right? Like where we all sit down on, like the biggest. I mean, I know the Super Bowl is big globally and that sort of stuff, but we all sit down and watch NFL football and every Sunday, right? And follow that. In Southern Ontario, they're all Bills fans or whatever, and everybody goes across the border to games and that sort of stuff. Nobody goes to Toronto Argos games, right? Um, or very few people. What does that say? Uh, Does it say anything? Does it say nothing? But I think we need to take a look at those things.
Yeah, I think many people across the spectrum can sense that something's not right here and in need of a change. But as you're suggesting, I think it's why you propose the second Massey Commission is that these things are complicated, and certainly when it comes to the measurement question, or even what our cultural policy is fundamentally about, easy answers don't jump out. That's for sure. But let's talk a bit about the key institutions in play here, Peter. So the CBC, obviously the big one, dominates the discussion of Canadian culture. But you argue that its current strategy may be crowding out innovation and independence in the private sector. What's the path forward for the CBC that preserves its value without distorting the ecosystem? And I should say, no need to rehash everything that you've said about the CBC previously, but in particular with respect to culture here.
Well, when it comes to the culture, I mean that's kind of the whole raison d'être for the CBC, right? Going
Right.
back to the 1930s, late 1920s, with the Broadcasting Act, because of the fear that NBC had a station in Toronto, for instance, and the fear was that and radio was a new and very powerful thing, and the Americans were producing all this really cool content in terms of radio shows in the evening and that sort of stuff, and the government sensed that oh my goodness, we're just going to get overwhelmed with American content and nobody's going to know anything about Canada. So the CBC was formed, and that's its core purpose. It was national cohesion, and so people in Saskatchewan could sit down in the evening and or listen to the news, and they could find out what was going on. Where, like my grandparents, for instance, in Saskatchewan, were from Prince Edward Island, but they could learn about what's going on in Prince Edward Island, and their parents in Prince Edward Island would be able to learn about what's going on in Saskatchewan, and we would learn about each other and hear our stories. Blah blah. That I mean, I know that hear our stories sounds kind of trite, but it's very real.
No, I get
Um,
that. Yeah, it sounds quaint to the modern listener whose
yeah, yeah,
information's
it
available at
does,
fingertips, but
but I'm I don't know. Maybe
no,
I
it had
should
a
say
purpose.
it's easier for people in Saskatchewan to catch the vibe in PEI. Maybe that works.
Oh, there you go. That's
For
very
people in
contemporary.
PEI to catch the vibe in Saskatchewan, right? Make me a little bit more modern, but with the CBC, it needs to get back to that. It's been functioning for years now, not as a public broadcaster, but as a publicly funded commercial entity, news
Mm.
and entertainment complex. It needs to get out of the commercial business entirely, and it needs to be 100% Canadian content. And it has to stop its news network, CBCNN, trying to imitate CNN and competing with it. Right? I mean, we need to take a look at how many American channels maybe that we allow on cable. I mean, the internet's there, so people can access it anyway. But I'm tired. I can walk into any restaurant in Pearson Airport, and whatever's on the screen, um, or in a lounge, airport lounge, it's going to be CNN, right? Like, what's going on with that? We need to stop doing stuff like that. I mean, I know you've got an international audience, but they're not going to be. I don't. If I go into Heathrow Airport in London, it doesn't offend me if BBC is on the TV, right? Like, they need to be local. We've got this sort of sense of cultural inferiority to the Americans that we don't admit unless we're, unless somebody checks out our behavior. So MSNBC and CNN are the big are the big viewers, but that's where the CBC needs to play a larger role. and it needs to actually become very focused on Canada and very good telling stories about Canada. I mean, and its head office, in my view, um, I don't think it's helping that its head office is in Toronto.
Hmm.
Don't get me wrong, Toronto is a fine place and a big
Center of the
part of.
known universe.
Hmm?
Center of the known universe.
Well, yes, yeah. Ask anyone, right? I mean,
Right.
but that sort of happens anywhere. But Canada's a big country. In order to effectively have a cultural impact, an organization like the CBC has to get away from the commercial need to serve that GTA audience that advertisers like,
Mm,
right? And needs to get away from obsessing. It needs to be watched, but it needs to get away with, you know, competing with whatever's on CNN. If CNN's going with Trump Live, then they feel like they have to go with Trump Live,
yeah.
that sort of stuff. And it needs to be much better at its job and more proudly Canadian and less commercial.
Mm,
And that's where it's the commercial part that interferes with the other broadcasters, with the private sector, right? Because it's you know one if you talk about journalists for a second, 1 in 3 journalists in Canada works for the CBC, right? In what you'd call the sort of mainstream world, and how journalists have been traditionally defined. So it's a big unit, and the more money you give it, the harder it is for anybody to compete with it. I don't know how people don't get that, but like if you're running a restaurant, if you're one of 5 fast food restaurants, or one of 3 fast food restaurants in town, and the government is subsidizing the other two, you don't have a chance, right? So why would you think anybody in media would have a chance? And without having a healthy playing field for Canadian media, cultural and news and sports, whatever. I mean, I count sports
mhm,
as culture, but if you're without having that level playing field, no one can succeed,
mhm,
right? So we need to, you know, now that it's probably been determined that the CBC is going to exist, it might as well be useful, right? And the way to make it useful is to get it out of the commercial business, make it a public broadcaster, make it focused on Canada, and make it accountable for
mhm.
making us better.
Yeah, enough mandate creep. You can't do all things well and while crowding out what others should be doing in the commercial space.
Well, none of us can live a dualistic life,
No,
right?
it, yeah, that's the
So,
story here. It seems like with respect to the different agencies, institutions, and grant streams, it's trying to do all sorts of things and pleasing everyone in a typically Canadian fashion, one might say. Um,
well, and in the broader picture too, when we're talking with CBC, that's where CBC, in terms of culture, that's where CBC can really be useful. So if you're going to be spending a lot of public money to subsidize something, right? What are you doing subsidizing a commercial competitor, right? Which is what we've been doing. Why don't you actually subsidize the creation of the Vimy Ridge movie, right, through the CBC? Or, I mean, in the past, CBC did a lot more stuff like this, right? Like in terms of programming, it should be. I remember the Railroad series and others, but these days it's not. It does show a lot of Canadian content in terms of its entertainment programming. But it can certainly, there's an opportunity for it to do better. And if the Prime Minister and Cabinet are going to give it more money, which they've decided they are, they should maybe look for outcomes from their investment.
mhm, mhm. Very good. Let's shift gears to the CRTC. Um, it's trying to enforce CanCon mandates on global platforms. Um, do you think the CRTC still has legitimacy and capacity to manage this new media environment, or again, is a more fundamental rethink needed here to ensure its mandate is properly defined and scoped?
Yeah, the fundamental problem with the Online Streaming Act that moved the CRTC, gave the CRTC authority over all the audio and video on the internet. I think is that you're essentially you're viewing the internet as if it was cable, right? And the fundamental premise is that the internet is broadcasting, or this audio and visual on the internet is broadcasting, which is, I think, really flawed. Right? It fails to grasp the core understanding that the internet is a revolutionary new form of communication. You can't relate it to previous forms, right? You can say that television was visual broadcasting from radio. Radio was just audio, and then broadcasting evolved, so it became video as well with television, and then it came in color, and then it came in better definition, and sort of gradual technological improvement of the broadcasting technology. But the internet is something entirely new, and its impact has been enormous. And the CRTC's structure is designed for a world of broadcasting. It's fundamental thing that, and I always describe it as trying to take the 21st century and stuff it into the 20th, right? And trying to make it fit. It's not going to work. It hasn't worked so far. When the Streaming Act was passed, it was indicated by everybody that it would largely be in place by the end of 2024, right? And we're halfway through 2025, and there are three different entities, if I get this right, but with two different court cases, or it's two different entities with three different court cases. I can't remember off the top of my head, against the CRTC for trying to do things like put a levy on Spotify revenue to fund news, right? And Spotify's going, huh? We have nothing to do with news, right? We're a music platform, and here's what we can do to help Canadian music develop, right? And the other thing is that they're trying to do it, and this goes back to these funds, by saying that we don't really recognize your investment unless we see it in funds. And Netflix would argue, look, we're spending $1 billion a year in the country on film and television, and a great deal of it would meet what you guys have called, Canadian content. It is, Canadians. We're using Canadian actors. Not all of it tells Canadian stories, in that sense. I get that, but they're trying to say, can you modernize your approach to what it means to be Canadian content? Because they want to get credit for the private investment they've been putting in for the last 15 years or so, and the CRTC can't really do that the way it's structured. It's all about, okay, we want 5% of your revenues, and they're going to go into this fund, and then that fund is going to distribute the money to independent producers who are then going to try to make an arrangement with you to show their film on you and that sort of stuff. And it can't work. There'll be too much resistance from the streaming companies, and I can understand the desire to say we want to be more discoverable on your platform. So
Right.
that's not hard for Netflix to do. They can just have, you've got your categories up there, even your Google TV. You can get companies to easily say, here's our Canadian section.
Yeah.
We can decide whether we want to be ghettoized in that fashion or not. But in terms of finding Canadian content, I always thought a search tool worked just fine. All I had to do was type Canadian into the search question, and I'd find it. But these are the issues that the CRTC is struggling with, and I think the CRTC's structure is so based on being an industrial subsidy that I can't see it as being a cultural solution at all. When I think the private sector would be much more likely, the way we've been going anyway. I'm not saying it would be the solution, but there's a way better chance we get the movie about the Plains of Abraham's battle, or the movie about Les Filles de Roi, the King's Daughters, coming to Quebec, and that's 2/3 of Quebecers are descended from those hundreds of, a few hundred, right? I mean, those are great stories, but nobody's going to know them, and especially with so many new immigrants, they need to know those stories too, right?
Hmm.
And because we are a country with a history,
Yeah.
right? And it has shaped us and formed us, and there are all kinds of great stories to tell. But I don't think you're going to get it through those funds, because they're really primarily, and I know they would argue this to the death, um, and there are lots of good people within it, but they are primarily an industrial subsidy, and it is not producing, and has not for 40 or 50 years produced the cultural outcome that it's supposed to.
Mm. Fascinating. Shifting now to the funding approach, beyond it being an industrial subsidy, it's definitely a common thread you've highlighted throughout the discussion. There are a number of other formulas in play pertaining to language, diversity, and regionalism. You've noted the English-French split no longer holds in the same way, yet the funding formulas are largely based on that. So should we revisit and and reshape the principles that guide that. And then at the same time, regional formulas they seem to hold some promise and peril as well. Minority groups, immigrant populations, third language cultural production. How do you think about these various factors that go into the determination of funding approaches?
Well, I think what's happened is, as these the old traditional French English structure tried to evolve, I think what you saw is all of a sudden you've got these split off. So you've got these sort of more micro funds. So you have a fund set aside for Black filmmakers. You see it constantly in the CRTC talk these days too, and others throughout the federal government. It's still, this is all implemented by the Trudeau government, where you've got, you know um, funds that focus on, Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC groups, LGBTQ plus groups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I respect the need for everybody to see themselves, the desire for everybody to see themselves in film. Um, but I think the idea that a filming, a funding agency can specify, and sort of micromanage the representation. So it's looking at sort of saying, do we have enough people of color in this film? Do we have anybody of a South Asian background? And what colors and how many, and that sort of stuff. Do we have East Asian? Do we have South Asian? Do we have Irish? Do we have Ukrainian? Do we have gay? Do we have lesbian? Is there a trans individual in this film? And going through all this sort of checking off this to try to get through that becomes an absurd bureaucratic exercise, which is going to suppress artistic creativity, in my view, where everybody's constantly looking over their back, right? In terms of that, Canada has changed so that 1 in 3 of us is a person of color now, pretty much, or Latino, or South American, or Middle Eastern, or South Asian, or East Asian, or African, or Caribbean background. Market forces will drive filmmakers and television makers and people who make advertising to serve those audiences and
Mhm.
create that reality. You cannot ignore 1/3 of the population and expect to find success, right? So if we need to get the government out of that business.
Mm. Very good. Final thoughts, Peter. If you were to imagine a new Massey Commission today, what would your new vision for Canadian culture be? What does it look like, sound like, feel like? Just a few thoughts in this regard.
Well, very quickly, I would say it would be one that takes pride in our foundations. In our, that if you looked back at our history, it would understand our Indigenous history. It would understand the circumstances that took place through through disease and other things that created this settler nation, as we call it, um, but also really and understands that, and understands that essentially the French and British were in conflict, fighting for hundreds of years over Canada before it sort of got settled.
Mhm.
And but that doesn't mean you got all those conflicts in it, but we also need to take pride in it. We can take pride in our individual points, and I would say that culture would be along the Sir Wilfrid Laurier quotes I gave about honoring honoring the land of your the lands and traditions of your forefathers and mothers, I guess, and building the land of your children. But that land should be fiercely and distinctly Canadian, right? In terms of our own sense of identity, not one that builds its culture around saying, well, we have healthcare, right? Which is just like crazy, right? You don't define yourself on a piece of public policy. That your character defines your public policy, not your public policy doesn't define your character, right? But one, I'm a monarchist, so I would be very happy to see one that was proud of our constitutional monarchy tradition. If you want to modernize it, I'm all open to that. One that is proudly Canadian without having to be anti-American. I don't think you ever define yourself through what you're opposed to.
Mhm.
In terms of that, well, I don't like guns, and that's what makes me a Canadian. Oh, come on, right? Like, what really makes you Canadian? What makes you a Canadian is the way you adapt to changing seasons. What makes you a Canadian is what gives you pride. What takes you pride in. What makes you Canadian is the future you imagine for your children and,
Mhm.
and and grandchildren. What makes you Canadian is the idea that, as with our forefathers and mothers, you look at this vast, terrifying land and you say, I'm going to conquer that. I am going to build something special. I am going to at times exploit it, but I am going to build a peaceful, prosperous nation using all those resources that were given us to do it. And we will be the envy of the world.
Wow. Very inspiring history and positive vision to ensure better informs our contemporary sense of identity. And I hope the future um, authors, conveners of Massey Commission are listening. That can kick them off. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today. For always insightful and great discussion.
Thanks for your interest. I hope somebody picks up on the idea and runs with it.
Thanks everyone for listening. I'm Peter Copeland for Inside Policy Talks.